Today I wanted to talk about CSS. A lot of people that I know don't like CSS, especially if you're a programmer and you're into JavaScript or you're a backend developer. You're afraid of CSS, doesn't make sense to you. So why is that? One of the reasons I think it's because CSS has to do with a lot of memorization instead of like logic. So what do I mean by that? So if we look at this list of CSS properties, there are like a lot of them, right? So there's all these things about borders and box stuff. If you're new to CSS, just this list is overwhelming. So what's even more overwhelming is this only comes with memorization and repetition. It doesn't There's no like logic behind it. You kind of just need to have in your brain that like, oh, text align, you can do left, center, or right. Like those are the three things associated with text align. And what makes it even more complicated is how these different properties may interact with one another. So for example, if I go into box sizing affects like the entire layout. It affects the entire box model. It affects like what borders would do. And if you add padding and margin, it's interlinked. Like this one property of box sizing is interlinked with all these other properties. And the only kind of way to know that is to have that memorized. It's a different part of the brain. It doesn't really use logic. It uses a lot more memorization. There's a lot more gotchas. There's not a lot of aha moments. There are more like gotcha moments, and I think that's why people don't like it. So how do you get better at CSS? And there's not really an easy answer. One way is to just practice. That is my tip number one, is to just practice. So practice, repetition, just use these different CSS properties. The more you use them, the more you'll have them in your memory. It's kind of like if any gamers out there, you play like a Dark Souls game, when you first go in and fight a boss in Dark Souls, you're gonna get wrecked, right? You don't know anything about the boss. The boss is going to own you. But you practice, you keep fighting that boss, you learn their move sets, you learn their cheesiness. Like CSS is a little cheesy, right? There are things that don't make sense. Like there's cheese in here, so you gotta learn the cheesiness. And once you have that and you have it in your memory banks, then you are able to defeat that boss. And that boss in this case is CSS. You don't need to master it. You just need to know enough about all these properties, how do they interact, to get better. So the first tip is to practice. So how do you go about practicing? There are a few ways. One of the ways is to just start with a blank slate and to just go and try to create websites that you see. This is not the most efficient way. The most efficient way would be to get paid for your time. Like if you find a job and they pay you money, you make these websites. The more websites you make, the different designs that you get, that's like the best way to practice, because you're getting paid to practice at the same time. If you don't have access to that, depending on where you are in your career, you may just be starting. You don't have a resume built up. You can't get hired because people want experience. Then you will have to practice on your own time. One of the ways to practice that I used to do is to just start with a blank slate. A blank slate in this example would be HTML5 boilerplate, and I'll just do a real quick overview. All that is when you download the code, they give you just some static files. So you get like a static index.html file. There's all this JavaScript stuff in here. I would just kind of blow all this stuff out. Like, don't let all this JavaScript stuff distract you, because we're not here to talk about JavaScript. We're talking about CSS. So it has a main.css file in here, and this is what that looks like. There are some pre-made styles in here, and there's also this normalize. So what normalize does, it takes all the little weirdness from different browsers and it normalizes it throughout, so you get a consistent experience. So you can kind of leave normalize. You can kind of blow all this stuff out too, but I would probably just leave it. And at the bottom here, I would go to a site. So this is kind of what, like, let's just take this site for example, right? This is a pretty standard site. There's like a banner area, there's like a header area. So I would kind of try to recreate the site. I would take the text, I would go into the index.css, paste in the text. This would be like the h1, like that. And then there would be a div around here, like so. Probably make this a better. And then you would just go in and add classes to it. And then you would try to recreate this site. If you're a beginner, then that's a daunting task. So that brings us to step 2, which is to use the inspect element tool in Chrome or Firefox or whatever browser you have. Probably not in Safari. Safari's inspector is terrible. So either Chrome or Firefox, they have really good inspector tools. And when you go inspect, it pops up the developer tools. And as you hover over these elements, you can see, okay, this is H1. They are using these certain properties, right? Maybe you don't have these properties committed to memory, but that's what is happening here. And then you can go and kind of have a cheat sheet of, okay, some of these, this is what line height does. This is what, font size does. You can go in here and you can adjust the different values. You get immediate feedback right in the browser. If you do screw up, like, oh, that's way too big, all you have to do is do a reload and everything gets reset. So this isn't like a permanent change. Tip number 2 is to use developer tools and inspect the websites. So if you're more advanced, like you can make this page in 30 minutes or whatever. The next step would be to go to one of these CSS gallery sites, I like to call them. There used to be a lot of them back in the day. My favorite one is One Page Love. I don't know if you ever heard of this site, but it is all websites that are just like one page, like either a landing page or a portfolio. They have this inspiration section, so you can have like, oh, I really like personal, so you can see like, okay, these are just personal websites of different people, but the designs here are usually top notch, and sometimes you get crazy just like, look at this one. This is a crazy site, right? There's got some weird there's probably some hovering JavaScript going on to make this effect, but like this site is crazy. Like, how do they even make this site? Well, go into something like this and inspect, right? Go around, inspect. You can see that this is a flexbox, this is a flexbox, this is a flexbox. You can see all the properties, like how are they making this site? So this is what I spend a lot of time doing. It's not glamorous, it's not fun, it's not easy, but like I found like, oh, this site was really cool. How do they do it? I wanted to know, so I would spend some time. Like, you don't have to make the entire page or whatever. You would just go and, this is a pretty cool thing. Like, how do they make this little picture thing? I would go and inspect it, and then you can kind of see, okay, it looks like it's just an image. So when you hover it, there's probably some transforms going on. Transforms and things of that are a little more advanced, but you can kind of see, okay, that's how they're doing it. If it's too advanced for you, you can kind of skip over it. So just inspect things, use the developer tools in conjunction with like a beautiful gallery site, inspect the things, and that will kind of help you learn these properties, because it's about repetition, it's about practice. Like Allen Iverson once said, we talking about practice. So you have to practice, and you have to kind of commit these things to memory. So that is tip number 2. Tip number 3, I would say don't really start with a framework. So a framework would be like Bootstrap. I wouldn't recommend starting with that. I guess Bootstrap is okay. You can start with Bootstrap, but if you want to start with a framework, I would prefer a Bootstrap, which has all the components built out. Another popular framework is Tailwind. I would recommend Bootstrap over Tailwind, because Tailwind uses utility classes, and you don't know how to use the utility classes yet because you don't know all these properties. Like, that's only effective if you know all these properties. If you don't know these properties yet and you're like a beginner, going into Tailwind doesn't help you because you don't have that committed to memory. So I would say Bootstrap would be a better starting point. And if you want to use Bootstrap, you should inspect it as well. So let's take an example of these headers, right? Before you use it, it would serve you well to inspect these headers and see what is going on. Like, inspect it and just get a overview of the classes and the styles that are being used. I'm not gonna say all the frameworks are bad and stay away from them. In fact, starting from ground zero is very daunting. What we did back when I was doing a lot of like WordPress themes and stuff like that, we actually had a base theme. So we had a base theme that was it was built on top of Bootstrap, and we kind of had something that looked something like this, right? We would have a template, base template, and we would just have a bunch of blanks in here. So every time we make a new website, we load up this template, and because like most of the websites that we did had like a banner area, they all had like columns and stuff. So just having a base skeleton layout ready to go, you can just kind of plop that into place. A lot of the work is done for you. Then you can kind of tweak it a little bit and change it a little bit. And the more you do that, the more you get familiar with all these different CSS properties. So tip 3 is don't start with a framework, but if you actually want to, then inspect it, kind of learn the inner workings of the framework. All right, so tip 4 is learn about CSS specificity. So if you did not know, CSS has I like to call them weights, right? Selectors of weights. So there are IDs, which you should actually never really use. There are classes, so that it's like a dot, and then the thing you type in. And then there are the base elements, like a P, just a normal P tag. So if I wanted to give an example, like a normal P tag. So this is like the lightest in terms of, if you're thinking about like a weight to put on this, weight meaning how heavy or light it is, these are like the lightest things, right? If you add a class to it, or like, let's say like container. So container, the dot here, associate to a class. If you were to use the ID, it'd be like the # container. So let me just move these around real quick. P would be the lightest, right? And if you add a dot on here, so let's say I have a P tag. and there's text. By itself, P is the lightest. So if you know the very basics of CSS, this P is going to, if I do like a text, a line or something, this is going to, style all the P tags. If I have a class, it's going to, and I have like, say, container. Container is a bad example for a P tag, but whatever. Container. Now anything I have in here is going to have a heavier weight because of this class. Anything I have in an ID, so this is a class. If I have another one that has ID of a container, this is going to be heavier still. So, and then if I have two classes chained together, container, text, this is two classes chained together is heavier than one class, but it's still not as heavy as an ID. Things of that nature. I like to think of them as weights because the heavier it is, the more it's going to override. So the more precedent that style is going to override all the other ones. The heavier it is, and then you can learn all about that. So tip number 4 is to learn about what makes things heavier, why you should not really use the pound sign, that's not really used anymore, why you should kind of keep things as light as possible. You shouldn't want to chain on like a bajillion classes just to try to override everything. And then there's one property, I guess it's not even called a property, one thing called like the important flag, how you should try to avoid that as much as possible. Basically almost never use important because that is the heaviest, and that's just going to mess with your mind. It's going to just make things really weird. So learn about that. CSS specificity, that is tip number 4. Tip number 5, this applies to CSS, this applies to all of web development, I think, is to have a fuzzy memory. Like I said, there's a lot of things to memorize. You don't have to memorize all of it, right? You go to one of these sites and you kind of like inspect what's going on. You don't need to memorize all of it. You kind of just need to know something exists, right? So it's impossible unless you're some savant genius and you have like a photographic memory, you can memorize it. So I started doing all this in like 2009. I still don't have every one of these memorized. Like I can't just go like, oh, what is font size adjust? Like I don't really know sometimes. I'll have to look it up. You can't have all these things memorized. And if you're learning JavaScript or React at the same time, like good luck, man. Like you cannot. It's impossible for you to memorize that. And if you are a savant genius, you shouldn't be doing this. You should be like counting cards in Vegas or something. This is not, you should be doing something that's making you way more money because you're a savant genius. But if you're not a savant genius like the rest of us, have a fuzzy memory. So just have an understanding of kind of what's going on. Say, oh, I know transform, for example, is a very hard property to know, or like CSS grid is also, there's a lot of things associated with CSS grid. Just know that you don't have to memorize it, you just kind of have to know something exists and you just go look it up, right? Because that's what the rest of us does. So those are my 5 tips. I think the most important one is to practice. Don't feel overloaded, don't stress about having to memorize everything. You're going to learn it as you do it. The best way to do it is to get paid for it. So if you have an opportunity like that is the best because you're getting paid to learn. Let me know what you guys thought about this video. This is not what I usually do. I usually have more code heavy things, but this is more of a tips kind of section. So let me know if you like this style of video. If you do, give me a comment below that you liked it. If you like this video in general, like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you very much.